Welcome to Accelerate Science Now, where we sit down with innovators shaping policy, research, and industry to ask one big question. How do we make science move faster and work better for everyone? Today on the podcast, we're joined by Rick Stevens, Associate Laboratory Director at Argonne National Lab, to talk about how decades of advances in computing have led us to a new moment for science. We discuss how AI is transforming research from autonomous labs that run experiments around the clock to exploring entirely new scientific questions. Rick also shares Argonne's role in the Department of Energy's Genesis mission and what it could mean for accelerating discovery across biology, physics, energy, and beyond. Enjoy the show. Today's guest is Rick Stevens, the Associate Laboratory Director for the Computing, Environment, and Life Sciences Directorate at Argonne National Laboratory, as well as a Distinguished Fellow at Argonne, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Chicago. Rick has been at Argonne National Lab since 1982 and has spent his career working at the intersection of high-performance computing, data, and scientific discovery. Rick's work spans computational and computer sciences, from supercomputing architecture to tools and methods for bioinformatics, cancer research, infectious disease, and other problems across science and engineering. In recent years, his work is increasingly focused on the use of AI in science and biomedical research, including leading Argonne's AI for Science and autonomous discovery initiatives. Rick is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, and has received many national honors for his research, including being named a fellow of the Association for Computer Machinery for his continuing contributions to high-performing computing. So, Rick, we're so honored to have you here today. Thank you for joining.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Great. So you really hit the ground running with a very impressive career in science. Was there something early on in your life that sparked your interest, made you want to pursue a career in science and technology?
Well, I mean, I was always interested in, I guess, how the world works, science as a way of studying that. Um, Lots of people in my generation were impacted by Star Trek and, this idea in the space program, and I grew up with the space program. So, physics, math, computers, these were all the fun things, but also biology. I spent a lot of time outside and um, doing things with nature centers and, learning how the world works and the natural world. So, yeah, I didn't really have any other ideas about what I would do. Of course, computers were such a huge, fascinating thing, growing up in the '60s and '70s, and so that was, almost guaranteed to be something that I would spend time with. But math and physics were really right there too.
Can I ask when you got your first computer?
Uh, let's see. I remember I was in um, high school or like a freshman in high school, and I managed to get into some program where on Wednesdays I was able to go to a place that had an IBM mainframe, and we had the machine to ourselves like all evening. Um, so that would have been like in 1974 or something like that. So there weren't personal computers really then. Um, and so the first machine I programmed on was this massive IBM mainframe. But then, yeah, later I had personal computers and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, makes sense that it's something would be so inspiring when access is limited and it's something
Well,
so
when you
new.
walked into like these old machine rooms, you'd walk in and they're this huge thing and lots of lights and, people scurrying around taking care of it and tape drives and, big line printers. And it was all very, cool and fascinating. And when you realize that you could actually understand it and you could write code, you know, um, later, we use punch cards and all kinds of things, interactive terminals. I remember I lobbied for the school I was in to get a terminal to the school district's like central computer, which was supposed to be for administrative things, but we managed to convince, I think it was the physics professor or physics teacher to get a terminal. And then we again had like create a computer club at the school because, nobody had access to anything. So
Yeah.
it was all great fun. Uh,
Yeah. And now we've got, toddlers walking around with iPads. They have no idea
no, they don't have
what
any
it took to
idea
get here.
how, what it was like, but it was fun back then and it's still fun now. And with AI going, accelerating, it's just super fun. the technology part of it's super fun. Of course, what you can do with it in science and other areas is also just amazing. So I think it's like you want to find that fountain of youth so you can keep riding this wave. It's like we've been on this, big wave for the last 45 years or so, and or longer, and doesn't show any sign of slowing down. And it's, just as much fun now as it was back then. So
Yeah. Well, I one of my questions was going to be, I mean, you started at Argonne so long ago and you've been there for over 4
yeah,
decades
I started. I
now.
mean,
I was
I came
gonna
there as a student, and I went backwards to school and stuff, and then I came back
Mm.
as a regular person. In the mid, well, I don't know, 87 or something like that, and uh, been there, ever since. Yeah, so it's been. I mean, National Labs are this amazing place. I'm in Argonne, but there's all the labs. There's 17 of them, and they're just kind of, like what you imagine. I mean, it's like again, go back to the Star Trek thing. It's like the closest thing to a starship you can hang out with, is because it's, your whole purpose at the lab is to do science, and you got a bunch of smart people you're hanging out with, and you have resources and tools and technology and computers and networks, and the whole purpose of these organizations is to advance science. So it doesn't have any other, mission. It doesn't have to make money. It's not supposed to be doing things in business and so on. Um, so really, even from first going there, and I also spent some time at Fermilab early on, and just felt like home. It felt like a place where you just wanted to hang out. And of course, as you get older in these organizations, you have to take responsibility for things. So I end up uh, having to you know organize money and direct people and try to drive initiatives and so on. But that's what we've been doing. And but we still, I mean, I still spend time every day coding, and now it's mostly vibe coding. But um, I, some people, move into management and they lose touch with what caused them to get into the field in the first place. But I've never gotten very far away from actually using it to do things. So I actually have more fun using computers to do real things than you know the management aspects of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, that's really great that you've been there, 4 decades and having fun the whole time is really
Yeah, exactly.
fantastic to
That's
hear.
the whole reason. Yeah, you get up in the
Yeah.
morning to have fun. You don't get up because you got to go give a talk somewhere.
Yeah, very fair. And so I'm imagine that, computing has changed quite a bit since you started in the 80s. Would you say like AI or something else has been kind of like what's been like the biggest change that you've seen that's really transformed the way you're doing your work?
Well, yeah, a couple things. Back in the '80s, we didn't really have computer graphics at all like the way we have now. So the idea that you can create movies or pictures in amazing detail and animation, none of all that kind of has emerged since then. So that's part of it. This notion that you can interact with machines in a very different way. Um, of course, we had small computers with small memories, and we had big ambition, but small computers and small memories. And so everything was always about um, what's the smallest version of the big idea you could do at the time. Whether I worked early on in automated theorem proving, this idea of using computers to prove theorems automatically. And we had computers that were tiny compared to, massively tiny compared to current things, but yet we were able to solve open problems and to advance that. Um, the AI part of it, even back then, there was AI. We didn't like to call it that. We called it automated deduction, but it's the same thing more on the symbolic side. That to me was what was interesting to me, using it to do mathematics, not numerically solve it, but symbolically to solve it. Um, and of course, that's part of the AI waves that we went through, where it was hard to make progress. Funding dried up. People worked on other things. I worked on parallel computing for a long time, worked on other things. But this idea of having computers that could be companions, intellectual companions that you would work with on a daily basis to do fun, cool, interesting, scientific-y things, was even at the very beginning, back in the '80s. I mean, that there were lots of people around. That was what we were trying to do. It's just that we didn't have enough data. Of course, we didn't even think about data really that way back then, but we didn't have enough compute power to do things the way that we do now. Now, what's changed, aside from the fact we've got billions of times more compute, In fact, we have a lot more than that because back then we were dealing with kind of million processors that operated at a million cycles per second, and now we have exascale machines that are like 10 to the 15th or whatever. So, or 10 to the 18th actually, and so just huge number about more computing. So that was mind blowing. Even back then, we would do calculations and say, well, if we just kept doubling, and we would get these numbers that were so huge, and we say, well, it can't possibly end up in this place where we've not only have we ended up in someplace much bigger than then. It was mind blowing because it's hard to get your head around these exponentials. So that was part of it. I think the other part of it is that you know, back when we were trying to prove theorems or build automated reasoning systems, we'd explain to people the idea, right, that a machine could maybe reason out a puzzle and it could solve a puzzle. And people were fascinated with that back then, back in the 80s, right? They're fascinated with it. And of course, now, all we have to do is go back 4 or 5 years and ChatGPT came out. And of course, we're seeing it all over again. People not only being fascinated, but realizing it's actually useful. Um, and it's still early day. I mean, it's hard to keep saying this over and over again, but it's super early days, right? So where we are right now, I've been going around recently and tell people we'll never have any less AI than we have now. um,
Right.
and and so it's hard to imagine, just like back in the 80s, we'd do these doubling calculations and saying, well, now can we really imagine a computer a billion times faster than the one we're using? No, we couldn't imagine it, but we thought, well, if it holds, maybe we'll get there. Same thing could be true with AI today, right? If we imagine the trends, continuing for another decade, another 2 decades, it's going to change, just really fundamentally how people interact with obviously the machines, but how they interact with each other and what becomes mediated with AI. And part of it's just uh, exciting because it's going to be so much change, but also because almost we're moving into a world where if you can imagine it, it might be possible. I mean, it's not like completely magic, but it's the
Feels
closest
that
thing
way
we have.
sometimes.
It's the
Yeah.
closest thing we have to magic, right? I mean, quantum mechanics is the real magic, but um, AI being able to do things and doing it amazingly quickly, it was unimaginable. I don't want to say it was unimaginable because we imagined it 20, 30, 40 years ago. We just didn't know how to do it.
Right.
Um, what's happened now is that it's hard. It's actually hard to imagine a world where we have so much AI that everything is different yet again. I mean, so that part is hard. We're in a space where the amount of tokens people are using are doubling every few months, and that puts us on another exponential, and it's very difficult in the near term, we overestimate the impact of these exponentials, but in the long term, we completely get it wrong. And so I think um, what this feels like, it's like you're driving down a dark road and your headlights are getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. You can't, in other words, you're still driving at 60 miles an hour. You just can't see very far ahead. Um, and that's kind of the world that we're entering in.
Yeah, really fascinating, kind of incomprehensible. One of the things I mentioned in your bio is that you are leading Argonne's AI for Science and Autonomous Discovery initiatives. Could you give like a quick elevator pitch of what those initiatives are focusing on?
Well, AI for Science, which we started about 5, 6 years ago, is aiming at basically using AI to accelerate scientific research. So ranging from, you know, mathematics, can we have AI improve our ability to prove theorems like I was talking about before, or our ability to write code for scientific simulations or to design experiments and then carry them out on robotic factories. That's what the autonomous discovery piece is about, which is trying to get robots to carry out the physical part of it and the AI to carry out the kind of intellectual or cognitive component with humans kind of controlling the whole thing. So it's not like we're trying to get humans out of the loop. What we're trying to do is empower people with enough technology that if they can imagine the experiment or they're curious about this material or this physical processes or something, how can you go from that question that you have in your mind to some progress on that problem as fast as possible? I mean, that's the idea. So this it ranges from, uh, how do we use current AI systems in scientific contexts, like in biology, where we're trying to understand say, the cellular networks in response to perturbations, whether it's, say, cancer or something else. Um, they're incredibly complex systems. We have 25,000 or so genes and a huge network of interacting components of proteins, and we only have partial understanding of how it works. And so, how can we use AI to actually zero in on the experiments to expand our knowledge, but also to use AI with all the existing knowledge we have to predict what, say, might happen on, say, under some treatment or some perturbation of the system. So there's many different ways in which I think AI can be used. I'm particularly interested in this question because we have such powerful models coming out of the frontier labs. How far can we get on certain problems, like in fundamental physics, if we just had kind of like unlimited tokens, coming from these models? Like, are there problems that we can solve with like pure thought, right? So this goes back to a couple thousand years ago, people sitting around philosophizing, just thinking about things, not doing experiments. Of course, couldn't write code back then, but just thinking out logically. How far can you get? And so, we know that in physics, of course, when Einstein was thinking about things, he did these thought experiments. What would it be like, to be in I don't know, riding a light beam, or being in an elevator where you can't see anything, and the equivalence between gravity and acceleration and so forth. And those were pure thought experiments. Now, of course, there was some data. The physics community, of course, had data and experiments, and there was things maybe that were not quite adding up. But the leaps happened by posing kind of puzzles and reasoning about it. And so that the reason that's interesting is that many areas of science become limited by our ability to do experiments, right? So we have some idea, we pose some hypothesis, and we need to then test that hypothesis by doing some experiments. And the experiments maybe take a long time. And so what happens is that you end up waiting, right, for those experiments to happen, or somehow have to do something else. And so you swap it to some other problem and so on. And by the time maybe those experiments are done, you come back and you can't even remember like why you were trying to do that. So that leads us to this kind of second notion of like, how do we accelerate experiments? And we, there's a couple different ways to think about that. Of course, one is to use simulation as a way of doing a lot of upfront work before you start physically manipulating things. And so that's been used a lot, more recently, whether it's in bioinformatics or other areas. And then this idea of robotics, or somehow building out automated systems for carrying out physical experiments, and then having AI translate the problem into something that the robots could do, say, in large scale, millions of experiments kind of simultaneously, or thousands anyway, and working kind of, continuously 24/7 kind of thing. So that gives us the ability maybe to scale up by factors of 100 or 1,000 or something. And if you
They're big
put an
factors.
AI, yeah, you put AI around that, though, the idea is that you're not going to be doing blind searches. You're going to try to have um, uh, directed, so the AI is choosing kind of the most valuable experiments to do, but you can still do them at somewhat large scale.
Right.
So
You
those are
mentioned
some of the,
one
yeah,
thing that I was going to ask a question on is that they're running 24/7. So, I mean, that's what I was going to ask. 'Cause I mean, obviously, one limitation to humans is that we have to sleep and eat and take lots of breaks. And
sure. Well, I
so,
mean,
are
yes,
these experiments going all time? Or are they observed constantly? How does that work?
in the cases where these things are stood up, yeah, they tend to run uh, pretty much 24/7. You're, of course, got lots of processes looking at the results and deciding what to do next, or to wait for other inputs and so on. But certainly, 24/7 gives you some multiplier of effort, factor of 2 or 3 or something, compared to what people would normally do during a day. Although human scientists get often hugely bottlenecked on meetings and non-productive effort. So there's that aspect too. Most, even experimentalists, don't spend all of their time doing experiments. They have to read email and stuff.
Right.
So yeah, so I mean, there's that aspect of it, but I think it's not just the 24/7 aspect. It's that a single person can conceptualize a large scale attack on something. So the way we kind of want to talk about this is like you're empowering each researcher with the scale of like a whole laboratory, and that's a new way of thinking about things, right? We know in the past, when there's been national emergencies or super urgent stuff like during COVID or whatever, where it time matters. We can run current human centered processes, 24/7. You need 3 or 4 shifts of people and so on. It takes a lot of resources to do that, but we know how to do that, but we don't know how to make the search or make these things super smart by having, in the past, right? We haven't had access to, say, AI that can ingest 1,000 times more information than a single person and can kind of integrate all of that and kind of suggest these experiments first, and what we learn from that we'll go over here. I mean, so orchestrating it in a much more efficient way.
And I know one claim about autonomous discovery is that it helps in reducing, human bias in experimentation. But I'm curious if you think, I mean, one, if that still bleeds in, or if there are any new kinds of bias that AI systems introduce.
So it certainly, well, I don't know if it eliminates human bias. It can do different things. So humans, I mean, we're biased in many different ways, and there's a technical term, so technical use of the word bias, and there's the social term. Technically, the thing is that humans will um, look at problems or look at experiments and maybe have unconscious or doing things in a way that doesn't even rise to the surface of conscious behavioral things that could affect outcomes. We see that, often if we have data from multiple labs, we can build a classifier that can tell which lab it came from because of the systematic error in the data, right? So that
Mhm.
comes partly from humans, but partly from if people are doing experiments and they're following a protocol, it's like a recipe. Well, you could give 10 different people the same recipe and say, make the dish, and it'll all be slightly different, right? Um, and that's, I wouldn't say necessarily bias. It's just that there's interpretation going on. So machines are going to have their own interpretation, whatever that is, but we might be able to control it in a certain way. But I think that's not the interesting part. I think the interesting part is something that we haven't really, nobody's really doing this yet, although there's hints of it, of getting to the point where the AI is pursuing questions that it's come up on its own, itself, and
Huh.
in ways that it's determined to answer the question. And so if you look at how AIs are trained today, of course, they're trained on massive amounts of data from the internet and archives and papers and so forth. But the vast majority of that, of whether it's scientific papers or even data sets being collected, have been the result of human processes. So humans asking questions, humans proposing the experiments, collecting the data in a certain way. So there's like a human kind of foot imprint on all of it. Not just footprint, but imprint on everything. And even the way that we say look at biology and we explain it to ourselves comes from our way of telling the story of how we have these different subsystems and they interact in a certain way, and we decompose it and we give names that imply a certain way of understanding. What would happen if, on the other hand, we ask the machine or ask the AI in some fun way to approach this without any of that, saying just go into the lab and make it safe or whatever. So it goes in the lab and it just does experiments and
Hmm.
say, just learn everything you can about this system and then come back and explain to us how the system works. Um, the thinking is that it will come back with a different way of explaining it than what we would come up with because we have priors when we go in, right? Prior understanding, and we interpret it in terms of our own theories about what things are. If we give the machine kind of a blank slate and ask it to do that, will it discover relationships that we're maybe blind to, or some more some alternative way of putting everything together that gives us a different viewpoint. And I think what we're really the deep question here is if we had the ability to create these really unique, novel, non-human viewpoints, not just in one area, but like across a whole lot of areas, would we learn something new? Right. That's the moral equivalent of like, aliens coming down that you haven't had any contact with. They have their own science, their own technology, and they come down and they're trying to explain, you know, assume we can figure out how to talk to each other, and they're trying to explain like what they know about the world and we explain what we know about the world. Well, would those two descriptions agree? Would they have different framings, right? And
Yeah.
um, so for the first time, we can almost do this experiment, right? Of what is uh, a neutral machine kind of framing, or at least maybe it's not neutral, but maybe it could be alternative tracks. And I think there's a sense that we should do that experiment and see if we get to places that we can't get with the current approach. We know in things like fundamental physics where you have like we know the standard model is not quite right. There's got to be some fixes to it, something beyond it. Gravity's not properly integrated in various things, and yet there's alternative theories, many dozens of alternatives, and they may or may not suggest experiments that might distinguish between them and so on. And this is an area where AI could really help because it can, it does, unlike a human where if you work on something for a long time, you become kind of vested with it. You become, um, you kind of become biased towards this thing that you've worked on, right? It's like when you're writing a paper, and you're almost done, it's very unlikely you're going to rip it up and start over again because you've become invested
Right.
in it, right?
Why you always
So
ask for a fresh set of eyes on something?
yeah, exactly. But if the fresh eyes of eye say throw it away and start over again, you don't really want to do that.
No.
But but in some sense we have to, right? I mean, so or not we don't have to, but I mean but if you're really looking for say a way of having a breakthrough, you kind of have to be able to ask that more fundamental question. And the question is can AI can we build AIs that are able to do that in an interesting way? That's some of what we're thinking about.
All very exciting. Well, I want to make sure that we get a bit into the new Genesis mission, launched
Sure.
by the White House last November, led by DOE, national initiative aimed at accelerating scientific discovery, national security, and energy innovation, all using AI. I'm wondering. I know that all the national labs are, working on this as well. Could you speak to what Argonne specifically is working on with the Genesis mission?
Well, yeah, it's not divided like that. I mean, there's lots of
Hmm.
projects in Genesis. Genesis has kind of two high level pieces. One is what we call building the platform, and that's hardware and software, models, data, basically a capability engine that we can apply to different problems. And then things that we're calling lighthouse problems or national challenge problems. And
Hmm.
there's on the order of 30 or so of these really big problems like accelerating fusion power or, you know, figuring out what's wrong with the standard model physics, things like that. And we have collaborations across the lab. So almost everything in that is a set of lab collaborations. Now, not every lab is involved in every topic, but um, but many labs are involved in many topics. So, at Argonne, of course, we have Aurora, the exascale machine that's part of the infrastructure that's being built up. I lead a thing called the Model AI Transformative Model Consortium, or ModCon for short. That is across a bunch of labs, maybe 12 labs, that is building capabilities around scientific workflows, around data pipelines, around core AI capabilities, ranging from scalable agentic networks to self-improving models to multimodal science models. But I'm like leading that, but it involves like dozens and dozens of people. I mean, the effort has like hundreds of people involved in it across many labs.
It seems like it's probably an added challenge to be, working across so many labs. But I guess also, more sets of eyes, more smart people
Well, it's
working on the
partly
same hard
that. It's part. I
problems.
mean, the expertise, in the labs is spread around, and that this is like the most exciting thing people can work on, so everybody wants
Mhm.
to be part of it. And of
Right.
course, yeah, it's not always optimal to have like, every single one of your friends wanting to be at the party all the time, but you can partition things up, and we have people leading sub pieces and so on. On the application side, there's about 16 projects, ranging from fundamental physics, like what we call Quarks to Cosmos, which is one that Argonne leading. There's things on critical minerals and materials, but again, like Argonne might be the lead, but it's like got 10 labs in it. Um, so we have projects spanning in these sets, biology, chemistry, materials, microelectronics, fundamental physics, um, things like inverse design of materials, uh, accelerating the development of small modular reactors or autonomous fission reactors, accelerating fusion. I mean, those was led by Princeton, but Argonne's involved. Fission one's led by Idaho. Argonne's involved. People trying to design um, quantum magnets is led by Oak Ridge. I mean, so there's lots of projects, and um, so we have people on the computer science side involved, math, computer architectures. We have people in the science domains, and yeah, we lead some of them, but other labs lead many of them, and they're also uh, open. These projects are kind of open in the sense that more partners are coming in. So I think that's kind of the vision for Genesis. It's going to be very partner oriented. This new consortium was announced yesterday. Um, that we've been working on it for a while, but I mean, it'll have a lot of industrial partners, and universities will join. And it's this Genesis has only been up and running for a couple of months, and the main idea here is um, banning or a gathering to build this common platform to accelerate the underpinnings of the AI, and then partner around many of these dozens of application areas to try to connect progress in AI to progress in some science or engineering field. And those are have foci in science discovery kind of problems, in energy related things, and in national security.
And you mentioned that, that it's not just the federal government, the national labs working on this problem. It's also institutions, it's universities. Could you explain like what the central role of the national labs as, the piece of the puzzle is in the Genesis mission?
Well, it's a DOE initiative, and
Hmm.
so the intellectual, uh, machinery to make this work is coming mostly from the labs, and the labs are where right now essentially all of the work is being done. So, um, we're building the physical infrastructure to support these things. The science teams and engineering teams are located at the labs, so the labs are kind of driving it right now.
Hmm.
What will happen over time is pieces of it will or new pieces get added, but universities will take on some of the research things. They won't take things away from the labs, but there'll be new stuff that they do, and some of them will partner with the labs. But they also will take on, hopefully, training. We call it training, but education. Basically, we need a lot more people trained in how to use AI in science and technical areas, and that's going to be largely the responsibility of universities to do that via enhanced PhD programs, master's programs, bachelor programs, certificate programs, things like that. So that's a huge effort that's going to happen largely at the universities, but it'll be part of an integrated activity with the labs. And then we have a lot of industrial partners, and what we're again, some of them will be involved in specific aspects of the program, but we're also interested in how this effort in Genesis can get translated outside of the labs into industry more generally. So not so much changing, say, what the frontier AI labs do, but what the um, domain industries do, like oil and gas or automotive or aerospace or whatever. Like, could they leverage the investments that DOE is going to start in Genesis into, say, a platform, and then can that get mapped into other areas of the economy? I think that's the idea.
Got it. Well, great. And so I know Genesis has placed a really strong emphasis on using federally curated data sets. Could you speak to why that's important, how high quality data shapes the effectiveness of an autonomous lab?
So data matters. I mean, it matters a lot because you're, of course, initially training on pre-training models on data, and that becomes like the base knowledge that the model has. Um, as you move forward, I mean, on some problem, right? The data that you might use to validate, say, a hypothesis or something is if it's not good data, then you don't get a good validation, right? So the model can't, the AI can't, um, make forward headway if the data is not very good. So there's, data quality kind of always matters. There, I think our notion of this is evolving somewhat. So, I mean, early on, there was uncertainty. I would say early on, I mean, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was unclear, like, what the trade off was between, say, a large volume of maybe mediocre data versus a very small volume of high quality data.
Hmm.
Because models like neural networks need a relatively large amount of data to learn. And so they just couldn't learn well from small amounts of data. No matter how good that data was, it just wasn't enough to do it. So as people started expanding the data sets to train neural networks, the concept that, well, maybe we're going to trade some data quality for volume would be okay, because that all of a sudden we could change the type of machine learning that we could do, and it would compensate for that. Well, we kind of know that that doesn't. I mean, at some point that doesn't work. That a huge amount of really poor data you can't learn very well from. So there is this trade-off between quality and volume. Um, and I would say that we're still trying to understand that. What's changed is that to the degree where current models can often learn from very small amounts of data, but it's mainly because they're trained on vast amounts of background knowledge. So this is kind of like how people operate, right? So, um, by the time you're 30 or 40 years old, you've seen a lot about the world, and you don't need a very large amount of, say, new data about some situation to kind of make sense out of it because you've got all that experience, right? Especially when you're dealing with people, you can kind of size somebody up really fast. And that's not because you're getting a huge amount of information from that one interaction. It's because you're using that and connecting it with all your vast background information. So what happens is models get better and better. I mean that in a kind of a technical sense here. Large number of parameters trained on much larger amounts of background knowledge. Their ability to leverage new data improves. Um, and ideally, if that data is super high quality, then the net outcome is really good. So we, you know, so so to advance things in science, right? We need high quality measurements, and I think we're still trying to understand like what this trade-off is between data volume, data quality, data types, and so on. I mean, there's another dimension to it, which is modality. Like, what I mean by that is, um, is it a image? Is it a time series? Is it 2D or 3D images? Is it you know a still picture? Whatever it is,
Yeah.
the the different type of data matters also. Um, and so yeah, I mean, I don't know. I probably didn't tell you very much on that
No,
piece.
that's all super fascinating and makes sense that there is that really important trade-off. I'm curious, are there certain domains of science that, have a lot more data, some domains that you really are lacking a lot of that, like high quality
Sh-
data?
uh, yeah. So, well, I think about it slightly differently. So there's areas of science where we've collected a lot of data, and almost always we've collected that data for some other purpose. not for training AI models, but because we were doing, physics experiments, or we were sequencing genomes or something, and somebody had a question, why is the elephant genome different than the human genome or something, as they collected elephant genomes. That's different than saying, if I want an AI that can do some problem, let's say interpret arbitrary genomes. Let me just pick that one for a second. Um, what will determine its ability to do that, in addition to maybe how high quality some genomes that it has already seen are, is whether it has seen genomes in certain types of environmental conditions or certain types of organisms. So what we call that is the distribution of the data. So what matters when you're trying to use data to drive AI is that you can often look and say, well, where does the model not do very well? Because it doesn't have any examples in this space. Can we get more examples in that space? And this is where autonomous discovery comes in a different way. So when we're currently using AI, say, to do something in material science, we can have the model tell us what part of a given, say, uh, problem area that we're looking at is highly uncertain about, because it hasn't seen data in that space before. And if it's very uncertain in a space that we want it to operate, then we need to go off and collect data in that space and do that automatically, ideally, high quality, so that it fills in those holes. That's a really interesting way of thinking about science, because it's not how science historically has been done. People would come up with a hypothesis and they'd go after experiments to answer or to try to address that hypothesis, explore that hypothesis. As a side effect, they collect data,
Mm,
right? So when we train models today, we're training it on the side effect of all these human questions.
yeah.
But what we really want is the models to explore the space that we're interested in asking questions about in a way that's independent of what humans have prompted before, so that the model has got a more uniform understanding of the environment, of the parameter space, or whatever. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing autonomous labs, because the science looks different. So historically, like with NIH, for example, if you were writing a grant, they would ask you to, what's the hypothesis that you're pursuing, or set of hypotheses. And in fact, if you didn't have a hypothesis, it was unlikely you would get funded. If you said, well, I just want to collect all this data, they would say, well, that's not science. That's just like stamp collecting. But it turns out that in order to improve models' performance in some general area, you kind of have to stamp collect in that area.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a tension. It's a different way of thinking about science, right? One of the things that we're trying to do is get the funding agencies and the people that run user facilities to understand that in order to improve AI in some space, like material science, we may need to do a lot of experiments that seem weird to humans,
Mm.
but they're
But they'll
basically
get you
filling
the
in these
data you want.
distributions. Yeah, exactly. But filling in the
Mhm.
distribution so that the AI can learn about some space that it otherwise would not do as well in.
If you could snap your fingers right now and have any data set, what would it be?
You mean any data set that I know how to
Like something that
collect?
you're currently
Or,
working on, and you're like, "Oh, man, we're really missing data on this."
well, in cancer, we've been working on cancer for a long time, and there's been data sets of tumors and drugs, and a small number of data sets on drug combinations. This is a really simple one, right? For most cancers, um, people are going to be treated with a combination of drugs, but we actually don't have training data for the vast number of possible combinations of drugs on the vast number of different types of tumors.
Mm.
So So, in fact, if we wanted to accelerate our ability to use AI, say, to pinpoint therapy, we would need that kind of data. And that's not going to come from patients, because patients, that's too slow. It's like we have to build a factory. It sounds weird, grow tumors and then
Yeah.
test them on all these different combinations of drugs, so that the model can learn the response surface across this entire thing that crosses different types of cancer with different combinations of drugs. That's just an example, but um, many areas of science are like that, where if we want to design say, materials that don't need as many rare earths, say from China or something, say better magnets or microelectronics, materials, we might need a whole bunch of experiments that try things that humans would say, well, that's not terribly interesting. And we'd say, yes, it's not terribly interesting for one data point. But if you do that across the entire space, that collection of data is very interesting for the model to learn from. So yeah, there's data sets I'd love to have in cancer, in infectious disease, in fundamental physics, material science. I mean, it's all over the place. What's going to happen as we put more and more AI into these science areas, the need to collect more data will increase. Just like as we're automating these science workflows, where the AI is trying to do simulations. Because one way we can collect data is have it run a simulation for the thingy that it's trying to measure
Right.
and collect that. So when we spin up these big agentic networks, they ask for millions of simulations, and we're like, ugh, our exascale machines are big, but they're not big enough to give 100,000 people each a million experiments, simulation runs. So there's going to be these interesting feedback loops, and that's part of what we're starting to see is that as we accelerate, it's kind of like the whack-a-mole game, as you accelerate one thing, something else is going to come up and you're going to have to do that. So as we build out AI, we're going to have to build out more supercomputers. As we build out more supercomputers, we're going to build out more experiments. As we build out more experiments, the AI will get better, and then it'll ask for it again. It's like that story. I don't know if you're these kid stories, like if you give a mouse a cookie, it's kind of like
Yes.
that, right? If you give an AI data, it's going to ask for this and then this and this and this and this, and it'll come back. Right. And that's kind of what I think is gonna happen.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's, in a good way if that happens, right? It causes a great acceleration. Um,
Yeah, it's all very exciting. Very clear need for more data. When with running all these autonomous experience, will that and then create more data to then be used elsewhere?
well, if it's public data, yeah, it could be used and built
Hmm.
on elsewhere. And
Hmm.
sometimes it won't be public data. There's lots of companies coming up that are startups that are in this AI for materials or biology, and, you know, they have a proprietary interest maybe in not sharing that data. Um, so the role of labs to produce, say, baseline open data sets, I think is going to be there as well. So, um, yeah, how open things should be is also a big question.
Hmm.
It accelerates, openness in general is good, but it also means that your competitors are being accelerated, whether it's
Right.
national competitors or whatever, right? Um, so those are some of the, policy level things people have to talk about.
Yeah. Lots of considerations. Well, I know we're getting close to time, and I want to maybe step back a bit and just ask a final question of if there's one thing that you wish the general public understood better about the role of national labs and that the role that they play in shaping our technological future.
Well, I think the main thing that I want people to understand is that they've been part of the U.S. Um, environment for 80 years, and they've accomplished a lot during that time. Of course, the roles in national security and energy, basic science, Nobel prizes, that kind of stuff, and they're often, uh, not always being in the news or not so flashy. I mean, people have a pretty good understanding of like what NASA has done in big missions. They can kind of think of that. But the labs, the DOE labs, have more people and more science, and it's the biggest enterprise in physical science that we have in the country, um, and it's very has very broad impacts, and it has been going on for a long time with very strong bipartisan support. So it in some sense underpins the research economy of the country. They also are places where large scale user facilities exist, like the light sources and neutron sources and big computers and nanoscience centers and particle accelerators and things like that. And those are unique assets, unique, national assets that have tens of thousands of users all around the country. Um, and so they're maybe not as visible as they should be, but they're an incredibly important part of the research ecosystem.
And really fun places to work.
And really fun places, yeah.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been really educational. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing and having fun while at it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Accelerate Science Now. I'm your host, Adeline DeYoung. This show is produced by Kindred Subjects, Accelerate Science Now, and Seed AI. Our executive producers are Josh New and Austin Carson. Special thanks to Kevin King for editing and production. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.